Hello, welcome to Taxpayer Alert. I'm Al Segalla. I'll be your moderator. I'm also president of the Calaveras County Taxpayer Association. And the guest we have this time is just really a wonderful man. And he's also one of the founders of the Taxpayer Association, Cory Burnell. Cory, welcome.
Good to see you again, as always, Al.
Okay. All right, Cory, I understand that you're a financial advisor, and you're quite a student in history and also economics. And our topic now is going to be economics. But you also have a family, and you live in Valley Springs.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about you.
Well, yeah, thanks, Al. Married my college sweetheart and moved to Valley Springs in 2004, where she was born and raised. And we have 3 children, all attending Calaveras Unified Schools. And I've been having had an independent investment advisory practice there since 2007, and it's doing well.
All right.
Yeah.
The topic of our discussion is financing and markets, and so we'll start in with the impact of demographic shifts in the developed countries on their economies and financial markets. Now that's complex, but I think you're going to make it simple.
Yeah. Well, simplify it a little bit from the standpoint of what we're seeing happen in the markets today. It's quite different demographically than essentially what I've grown up with. You know, the boom of the 80s and the 90s, and then the early 2000s, we had a population that was essentially growing from a productive standpoint. Everybody was working, and now we have demographically populations in the U.S. and around the world, particularly Japan and Europe, are aging and now retiring. So we have the baby boom generation of about 78 million Americans, all turning that retirement age since 2008. And that's going to go on for about 18 years total, so we have another decade of that. And that's people leaving the workforce and then drawing down the savings from their working years. And so we're going to be experiencing very different markets in the coming decade than what we've seen in the prior 3 or 4 decades as a result.
One of the things that is a concern, well, for the last 100 years has been a concern, that's socialism.
Sure.
And they don't use that word anymore, but the socialist policies are being implemented, and they seem to have a negative effect on prosperity and sometimes human happiness.
Yeah, you know, and on that subject, when you look at the effect of socialist policies, generally people will drop out of productive behavior because they're now being taken care of in some way, shape, or form through a socialist program that's providing their sustenance or whatever that might be, food, healthcare, housing, something that they otherwise would have worked and provided for themselves. And it's similar that what we're seeing, the effects of that, or what we're going to see from the demographics of baby boomers retiring, is that folks who were working and saving and putting into the capital system are now drawing their savings down in order to live off that. And that's quite all right. They certainly earned the right to spend their savings. That's what they saved it for. Yeah, but they have left the productive marketplace, and so it's going to change the market significantly and make it difficult for capital markets to grow from an equity standpoint. And that's what socialism does, in that it takes people out of productive endeavors that grow markets and grow economies and puts them in a position of, living off of somebody else, unfortunately.
I think Margaret Thatcher is quoted as saying, socialism is wonderful until you run out of other people's money.
That's right. Yeah, and you know, we see that in some of the socialist countries in Europe, as then they hike tax rates, and you know, famously one of the French actors moved to Belgium so he could avoid this unimaginable tax that the French were putting on wealthy people there. So it has a way of driving capital elsewhere as well.
One of the booklets that I read when I was back in 1964 on the nature of human rights, and also the basis of the economy, is the law by Bustier. Mm-hmm. And this little book here, I don't know if you can, yeah, you can see that. That's on our website. Anybody can go to it and download it. It's in PDF format.
Right.
But it lays out what human rights are. Apparently there's 3 of them: life, liberty, and property, which are also picked up in our U.S. Constitution in the 5th and 14th Amendment. Not in the Declaration of Independence.
Interesting.
The word pursuit of happiness substitute for property. We look back in history, we had a tremendous amount of controversy over the slave trade. You know, people owning other people.
Right.
And Jefferson wisely didn't use property in describing the 3 basic rights. He used pursuit of happiness, and that satisfied everybody. But in the Constitution, they brought property right back in.
Yeah.
Life, liberty, and property.
Well, it's interesting to me you mentioned that book, because there are 2 books that have changed my life. One's the Bible, and then the second one was the law. I remember reading it for the first time on an airplane, and would recommend it to anybody.
Yeah.
You can read it in one sitting. It's fantastic, and it will absolutely modify your worldview, and I would say even correct it, perhaps. It certainly corrected mine where mine was off.
Yeah, I had the same experience.
Yeah.
So the principle of comparative advantage in trade and wealth created among individuals, counties, states, and nations. I guess the principle of comparative advantage would mean that people would want to move to states or counties where they'd like to be more happy and more prosperous. Is it?
Yeah, to an extent. If we want to talk about books that have really changed the world, like Bastier's The Law, one was Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations.
Yes.
And he, in that work, talked about trade and comparative advantage among economies, and that one economy maybe perhaps has an advantage in producing grapes, and another one has an advantage in producing rice, and they'll trade, right? The one that can produce grapes will trade with the one that can produce rice. So they each putting to work the assets that they have. And as we look at Calaveras' economy, for example, there's a number of ways in which policymakers ought to approach it if they would understand this notion of comparative advantage, meaning we're not to look like Stanislaus County, perhaps, or Marin County, for example, but rather identify the assets that Calaveras County has that makes us different and unique that those other counties don't have, and create the policies in place that will foster those industries and put those assets to work. So, for example, vineyards, Calaveras grapes and vineyards are really up and coming, and the wine industry is doing great, and it's attracting quite some attention and certainly some wealth for the county, and tourism always has been, and it's a fantastic retirement destination for people from the Bay Area. So we have a number of assets that, as a local economy here, we ought to market and foster and put policies in place that, sell those assets to other people who would like to come here, as you mentioned, move here and live here and work here and participate in those industries, grow the economy that way.
You mentioned the burden of regulation in the securities markets and how it can negatively affect investors.
Yeah.
I guess a little bit of regulation is good. Too much regulation destroys what it wants to regulate. Is that true? Or
yeah, it really does. You know, typically when we see in our industry, the securities industry, financial advisory business, and the investment marketplace, there's this notion that regulation somehow always benefits and protects investors, and that's not necessarily the case. I'll give you a perfect example of one way it harms investors. There's a fantastic website called Seeking Alpha, and authors can post articles on investment topics. However, if you are a registered representative with a brokerage firm, take for example, you're an advisor at Merrill Lynch, for example, you cannot post on Seeking Alpha because of regulation. And these are outdated, antiquated laws or regulations that created by an organization called FINRA and of course the SEC. So what does that leave on Seeking Alpha as far as authors and advice if you take professionals out of the equation? Amateurs. And so,
Bad advice.
Bad advice. So, point being here, regulation has prohibited a whole portion of professional advisors from participating on one of the best investment advice websites out there. Another one is cost. Investors are constantly complaining about the cost of investment advice, and yet when an investment advisory practice really gets up and going, it is very costly. I see advisors with 2 and 3 assistants to handle all of the mundane regulation that's put on them. And then those advisors don't spend their time actually managing client assets, but rather doing what? Marketing to get more clients and increase their revenue because of the cost of their business. So they get in this vicious cycle rather than doing what the clients actually really could use from them, which is asset management and actually meeting with them and advising them. So just a couple of examples where regulation in our industry really harms investors, and we need to be aware of that principle in all industries and businesses.
Wow. The effect of regulation can be quite dramatic. It seemed like we're using regulations to substitute for morality. In other words, for right and wrong, if we can control people's behavior enough, then we can force them to do only right things and not do wrong things. Is that
right?
That's kind of a crude summary.
Kind of the idea, I guess. You know, in our business, I've long advocated when I talk to other advisors, hey, I wish that we would punish the bad apples so badly that nobody would ever want to be a bad apple. But what happens, you know, in white-collar crime, they get a slap on the wrist and they're back out doing it. I mean, so far, I can't think of anybody who's gone to jail or prison for the hedge fund, the financial debacle of 2008. Obviously, there were a couple hedge fund managers who've gone to jail for insider trading. But what about bank corporate executives? You know, and cooking the books on the banks and SIVs, these special purpose entities and stuff that would they would have off the books assets, and yet no jail time.
Oh, that raises a current issue. Apparently, there's controversy with Wells Fargo.
Sure.
What's your take on that?
Yeah, you know, Wells, it's interesting you say that. I was with a community bank, Bank of Lodi, even here in San Andreas was one of my branches, and Wells Fargo bought the bank, the parent bank, Placer Sierra Bank, and I had to make a decision of whether to work for Wells or not. And so I know, and I had friends who worked for Wells and have for a number of years. I know that there was a lot of sales pressure in that organization, and it's interesting. I really don't believe that the notion of create false accounts really comes down from the top, but I do think that there probably at some regional levels were some guys who were so pressured to make their numbers that they kind of forced their teams to do it. I do think there was an air of an environment there, a sales environment that certainly if you had some bad apples, they could figure out a way to essentially make their numbers look better by doing those fraudulent bank accounts. But I would be really shocked if that went higher up than a few regional people trying to meet their sales quotas. But it looks like Congress is going to try to get to the bottom of it.
Well, I hope that we get an honest investigation.
Yeah.
That's important.
Yeah.
Now, speaking of money, our country is approaching $20 trillion of debt. We have a political season. We have presidential candidates talking about everything in the world, including sex, but not any plans for reducing or eliminating that debt.
Yeah. Yeah, this seems to be the first reality television presidential election, you know, it really is something else. Yeah, when it comes to the national debt, and here, you know, back on some of those principles or characteristics of the markets we talked about earlier, I mean, the $20 trillion you speak of of the publicly funded debt doesn't include the unfunded liabilities of Medicare and Social Security. So
and pensions.
And pensions, which keep in mind there's the federally subsidized Pension Benefit Corporation that the Fed's back that is to back pensions, so if there's pension failures. And if I was going to give a prognosis on how pension plans will do as far as investment returns going forward, the demographics I mentioned earlier in the show mean I really don't expect the next 10 years that we'll see a stock market average outside of single digits in rate of return. So that number might look something like 6 to 8% a year as far as a 10-year average. And the reason being is the pension funds and 401ks and IRAs that people own are going to be drawn down. The baby boomer generation is going to draw them down. So you actually have a capital drain from the markets that will weigh on investment returns, and that's going to hamper the health of pension funds and their ability to fund the payments they promised. Now, either they get bailed out, or those promises get renegotiated through a bankruptcy settlement of some sort. However the system works out, but point being, people won't get the promises probably that they're anticipating or expecting. Or a company has to fully fund the pension through additional contributions, which lowers corporate earnings and hurts that company's stock price.
So in the case of public employees, if there's a shortfall on the liabilities, in other words, the payments that they need to make to retirees, they go back to the taxpayer.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, particularly if you're looking at state pensions, the state of California can't go bankrupt and simply say, hey, let's go to court and renegotiate those pension promises we've made. So far as I know, I'm no bankruptcy attorney, but that's how I understand the situation.
How would that situation affect the return that you might have in mutual funds or different investments that not have anything to do with pensions?
Yeah, negatively, because as you have this capital drain, keep in mind markets are big things that move based on the amount of money going into them or coming out of them, and so
right.
As you have a much greater capital outflow as people spend down their savings, it's going to be very hard for markets to stay buoyed. When you have pension failures, it's also a negative news item, and it certainly is a problem for whichever company promised that pension. And so now you have a situation where the stock price of that company may weigh on the overall market. You may take a situation where you had a company completely blow up, like Enron or Global Crossing or WorldCom. Those scandals back 15 years ago caused a confidence crisis in the markets, where people now don't want to invest because they just simply can't trust the numbers they're being told. Right. And so capital sits on the sidelines. So yeah, going forward, I just don't see a real positive outlook for stock market returns. They'll still certainly be better than you're getting sitting in a bank. Right. The other thing about the interest rate environment that this type of capital flight contributes to is lower interest rates, because we'll see people, baby boom retirees, shift from the equity markets over into what we call fixed income, which is bonds and loans, and that makes that in effect is that investor moving from being an equity investor to a lender. And of course, if there's much more capital being lent, then interest rates fall because capital is available to be lent. So you have, we may see a significant time still of low interest rates, though they really can't go any lower. I mean, they got to go up at some point, I suppose.
It seems like when more money is put into the marketplace, the value of the existing money proportionally reduces, and that's cause of inflation.
That's right.
But we've looked over the past years, and we don't seem to have any a major inflation. In the grocery store, I think I see it.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
I'm not sure if this is a picture overall.
You'll see it in some of those hard commodity items, perhaps where there's limited constraints. But keep an interesting concept that I didn't understand until kind of early in my career as an investment advisor, is that the money markets and the amount of money out there is a function of, it's kind of a balance sheet function, and as the Federal Reserve and central banks create money and pump it into the system, or the fractional reserve banking system, which I know you're familiar with, creates money through fractional reserve lending, As that money supply grows, keep in mind that when there are bad debts on the other side of a ledger that are getting written off, then that's a contraction in money supply.
Right.
So that was an asset that was out there that now has disappeared. And so when you see sovereign debt failures like what's going on in Southern Europe, as those bonds that are on somebody's balance sheet as an asset somewhere, as they get written down or written off completely and they go to 0 or 50 cents on the dollar, that's money actually disappearing out of the system. And so you can have central banks pump money into the system without inflation for a period of time, so long as asset destruction is happening in those loans getting written off and written down, neutralizing. Eventually that bad debt works out of the system, the money creation spigot doesn't get turned off, and then you get the hyperinflation we have seen in past years, like the 70s or Germany in the 20s.
It seems that there's a link between inflation and productivity. We have an annual product that we evaluate our productivity, gross national product.
Yeah.
And so as people invent things and our technology makes our life easier and quicker, and we can do more with less human energy, then that increases our gross national product. And so say that increase in productivity would be 5%. Then it seems that you could inflate the currency by 5% and be neutral. Is that accurate?
It is an ingredient, because as productivity grows, it will grow the economy, and then it can absorb that additional money supply. What's fascinating to me is that in the last 15 years here, we have had the most incredible productivity gains the world's ever experienced, with the internet becoming so available to everyone, and then supercomputers in the palm of our hands.
Right.
Absolutely fascinating, the amount of work that one individual can get done now.
Right.
And yet, since 2008, we've had this anemic GDP growth of less than 2% a year. And so that got me thinking, well, what is changed with our markets? If we had had the type of productivity growth that we've experienced the last 15 years, back in, say, the 1980s, when the baby boomers were in full swing of production into their career growth, it would have been incredible. It already was good, but it's been phenomenal. And of course, we did have great productivity growth then too. We had personal computers come out, and so everything's really has been. But the last 15 years, just incredible inventions and connectivity. I mean, the notion of how efficient it is now when you drive your automobile and Google just reroutes you around traffic. I mean, that's fascinating, right? I mean, traffic is becoming more productive. And yet we have this anemic GDP growth, and it simply is that weight of the demographic shift. We have so many people leaving the realm of using these new gadgets and things to be productive and actually create wealth, and they're drawing down the wealth they already built.
It seemed like squandering of money by government has a negative effect. I just discovered that there's billions of dollars, I think $6 billion, being transferred to illegal aliens through these addresses, post office box, and from the IRS, and it's called, I think, negative taxation. In other words, they put in a return, and they don't have to pay any tax, but they get money from the IRS.
Right. Yeah.
And to a tremendous amount, and the people come across the border when it's time to get their checks, and then go back to Mexico. Well, these are illegal aliens.
You know, I've been fond of saying to people about Democrats and Republicans, because people want to pit them against each other.
Yeah.
Both of them provide welfare. Democrats actually just send out welfare checks or food stamps. Republicans do it through the earned income tax credit. You file a tax return, and then we give you welfare. So both parties do it. It's just a matter of how sneaky they want to be or don't want to be about it. But yeah, I think you're speaking of the earned income tax credit, or if they file a tax return and then they show these dependents, they get these tax credits,
Which is welfare.
which is welfare.
Yeah.
And that's how the GOP does it. So both parties are
That's not very. We have to get.
Yeah.
I think we have to encourage them to get more logical, or maybe read the law by bustier.
there you go. that could set them right.
Now there's other things that the government is doing that has an effect on the economy. Probably the principal one, as you've already touched on, is the increase in regulation in practically every area.
Mm-hmm.
And I notice in the real estate field, right now, to sell a home, if you follow all the advice, you need to have 40 to 60 pages, mostly disclosures.
Mm-hmm.
There's only a couple pages that are actual contract,
Right.
which is the important part.
Right.
But you have all these other things. And then when you have all these pages, they need to be initial. And then the real estate agent needs to initial everything. And all these clauses are in there to protect the agent or the buyer or the seller.
Sure.
Now, when you have such a volume of things that are nobody reads actually,
Right.
what is the chance that some initial is not put in the right place, and there's therefore grounds of for a lawsuit for failure to disclose?
Yeah, that's right. In fact, you just use the magic words. In our industry, it's the same way. I have clients ask all the time, can you shut this paper off? I get so much paper in the mail. I just want everything turned off. I don't need to receive all of this information. I say, hey, I don't want you to have to receive all that either. You can thank lawyers for that, because every time an investment firm gets sued, it's for failure to disclose.
And
right?
then comes a new clause.
Right, so you have to disclose something. So now they've all gone to, we will disclose absolutely everything, whether you want to hear it or not.
Yeah.
And so that's just a cover your butt situation for the firms.
One of the things I'd like to see in the real estate industry, which I'm a part of, is some effort to reduce the paperwork. Mm-hmm. And I remember, well, back in the 60s, a home contract would be 2 pages.
Sure.
And the basic stuff. And actually the same 2 pages are used now,
Yeah.
which is the basic contract. All the rest of it is all
the disclosures.
all disclosures.
Yeah, in our business, when I started in the industry in 1999, 2-page form opened up a brokerage account.
Yeah.
And you were off and running. So the regulation is just tremendous. It's government's way of getting involved, I suppose.
Well, we've covered
Running costs up.
We've covered a lot. We've got. If you were going to buy a stock, what stock would you buy today?
That's a good question. There are 3 that I like a lot. I like. I'll mention 3. That way, I can't. Nobody can say, "Hey, you told me to buy that one." But I like Interactive Brokers as a brokerage firm, Stamps.com as a shipping and delivery service, and hey, Chipotle Mexican Grill. It's good food and healthy again. All right.
All right. Thank you for being our
bet, Al.
guest. Thank you for watching Taxpayer Alert. See you next time.